Chapter 5, 1967. Tupten Yeshi meets a Russian princess. Hippie culture was born in the 1960s and featured a growing interest in Eastern mysticism, meditation, and nirvana. Flower children were putting on backpacks, leaving home, and traveling the world. Asia, particularly India and Nepal, became an irresistible magnet to these disenchanted, largely middle-class Western youth searching to find peace, love, alternative states of consciousness, and communication with other cultures. It was inevitable that many would encounter Tibetan refugees and Buddhist monks from the land of snows. Ghum, West Bengal. At the beginning of 1967, Gen Losang Gyatso invited Zopa Rinpoche and Tupten Yeshi to take a holiday at Domo Geshe Rinpoche's Samten Choling Monastery in Ghum, just 5 miles below Darjeeling. It was thought the weather there would be easier for both Zopa Rinpoche, who was suffering from a bout of hepatitis, and Tupten Yeshi, who was also unwell. They planned to stay for 9 months. While there, Tupten Yeshi intended to further his studies in astrology, Tibetan grammar, and poetry. Before leaving Buxa, they said goodbye to Chöpel and Losang Nima, who stayed behind to look after Lal Bungalow in their absence. It had been 8 years since Zopa Rinpoche had left Domo Geshe's monastery in Pagri, Tibet. The chubby little boy was now tiny, with small, graceful hands and arms and legs as thin as sticks. Losang Gyatso made various divinations which indicated that if Zopa Rinpoche were given some possessions from his previous incarnation, the Laudo Lama from Solo Khumbu, his poor health would improve. They located one of his uncles, who handed over a set of the previous Laudo Lama's water bowls. Zopa Rinpoche carried them with him everywhere, and as predicted, his health did improve. The son of the benefactor who had built Samten Choling Monastery gave Zopa Rinpoche a few English books he painstakingly memorized no less than 3 times. But with little opportunity to exercise his English vocabulary, he forgot the words each time. They simply would not stay in his mind. "I should have just studied Dharma," he joked later. The 2 visitors settled in at Samten Choling. Tupten Yeshi with his texts and Zopa Rinpoche, whom the monks there affectionately called Little Domo Rinpoche, with the English books and art materials provided by his sponsor, Audrey Cohen. During this period, Tupten Yeshi took teaching on the 6 yogas of Naropa from Tukse Rinpoche, a Drukpa Kagyu Lama, who, together with Drugchen Rinpoche, had founded Drug Sangag Choling Monastery in Darjeeling after fleeing Tibet. Darjeeling was a charming small town in West Bengal in northeast India, located in the lower Himalayan range at an average elevation of approximately 7,000 feet. Because of its temperate climate, picturesque surrounding hills covered in tea plantations, and stunning alpine panoramas, it had become a popular hill station during the British Raj. On very clear days, it was possible to see Mount Everest in the distance. The area was filled with Tibetan Buddhist monasteries of all schools, and many Tibetan refugees settled in the area. Compared to Buxa, Darjeeling was high civilization and well placed on the hippie trail. In 1966, Lama Anagarika Govinda, a German monk ordained in the Nyingma tradition, published an enormously popular book, The Way of the White Clouds, about his experiences with the previous incarnation of Domo Geshe Rinpoche at his monastery in Darjeeling. Meeting Zina Rashevsky. Some months after Tupten Yeshi and Zopa Rinpoche's arrival, a tall, glamorous Western woman turned up at Samten Choling. This was Zinaide Rashevsky, then aged 36. Zina's father, Vladimir Rashevsky, had been a member of the court of Tsar Nicholas II, the last Russian Tsar in St. Petersburg. Vladimir and his entire family were commoners, not nobility, though Vladimir's sister, also called Zinaide, married into royalty when she wed the Grand Duke Boris, Tsar Nicholas's brother. At the time of the Russian Revolution, the family had escaped to Europe and settled in a big house, Sans-Souci, on the French Riviera. Vladimir was penniless. In France, he met and married Harriet Strauss, daughter of Chicago banker and real estate millionaire S.W. Strauss. Their only child, Zinaide, was born in New York City on September 1st, 1930. 2 years later, the Strauss fortune collapsed, and Harriet's inheritance disappeared along with it. Later, Zina recalled her earliest years at Sans-Souci as the happiest of her life, even though her parents separated when she was still a child. Vladimir remained on the Vladimir remained on the Riviera while Harriet moved to the Virgin Islands, leaving Zina in New York with her maternal grandmother. She was a wild child and not easy for her grandmother to manage. Zina grew up to be an extraordinarily beautiful young woman with thick golden hair, skin like cream, flashing almond eyes, and a rosebud mouth. Spoiled and precocious, she spent some of her childhood in Hollywood, where she became a celebrity starlet. Her name appeared in the headlines a number of times for her wild antics and in connection with several drug scandals. At the end of World War II, she rushed to Paris to join her father, who had become the quintessential penniless boulevardier. Zina did not flinch at the prospect of having to support herself. She appeared in a number of B-grade movies, worked as a stripper at the Crazy Horse Saloon, sang a duet with Maurice Chevalier, and posed for designer Jacques Haim in a crowd-stopping fig-leaf bikini on the Place de la Concorde. Zina floated among some of the most fascinating people in Western society on both sides of the Atlantic. She hung out with beat poets Gregory Corso, Allen Ginsberg, Jack Kerouac, and others, rubbed elbows with Russian nobility in exile, and knew many influential members of the New York and European arts and cinema scene. From a wild child, she had become an outrageous young woman, and her escapades were perfect fodder for gossip magazines. In 1948, when Zina was 18, she married Count Bernard d'Harcourt, a descendant of Louis-Philippe I, King of France. To celebrate, they gave a fabulous Venetian ball in Hollywood. The marriage lasted just 1 year. She soon married again, this time an American, Bill Barker. That marriage also failed. In the 1950s, she married another American, Conrad Rooks, an aspiring filmmaker and heir to the Avon fortune. Conrad and Zina had a son together, Alexander. Zina and Conrad kept a house on the Greek island of Mykonos, where the couple and their son spent a few months every year. Then Zina became pregnant to another man. While Alexander remained in Greece with his father, Zina moved to their house in Kandy, Ceylon, where she gave birth to a daughter, Ria. Throughout all this, Zina was known everywhere as Princess Reshevsky, which was stretching things rather a lot. However, Princess Reshevsky she remained. Babe in arms, she returned to Greece, where she fell in love with German actor Nicholas Duchke. "We were both immediately attracted to each other," said Nicholas. Zina, the Russian princess, hippie queen, with this little baby, trying to find a place where she could hide, come down, somehow get away from it all, and rest. She wanted to leave immediately for India, but I was successful at the time, driving around in Jaguar cars and having responsibilities. I couldn't just up and leave. Zina was very unhappy. Her wealth had gone, her figure had changed a lot after the second pregnancy, and her close friend Nina Dyer had died mysteriously the year before. When Nicholas returned to Berlin, Zina wrote to him from Athens. "The apartment is darkened by curtains. Rolling Stones on the radio, and the hiccup of my daughter Ria. I get out on the streets to escape the tourist crowds, only to find the walls of my inner chaos, which I cannot escape from. 2 days after you left, I swallowed 6 sleeping pills, waking in tears and hysteria, wondering when the nightmare would end, if it would ever end. Determined that this time the karma of my Western life will not be repeated, if ever I make it out of here. Go east, Zina. Nicholas, if we meet in the east, there will be so much time. Zinaid. Zina went back to Kandy to visit Conrad Brooks. He told her she might find a teacher in Darjeeling. Zina had played around with fashionable witch covens in Paris and had almost certainly read Govinda's Way of the White Clouds. Before going to Darjeeling, Zina first went to see the imposing head of the Kargyu lineage, the 16th Gyalwar Karmapa, at his monastery in Rumtek Sikkim. Overcome, she collapsed in tears at his feet. The Karmapa held her hand and gently told her to go to Darjeeling and find Domo Geshe Rinpoche. On arriving in Darjeeling, Zina and Ria took up residence in the Hotel Windermere. In April, while strolling on the terrace, dressed from head to toe in black leather, she met Jean Smith, an American scholar who had been a part of Lowell Thomas's expedition to Buxa. We both knew people from the scandalous London set of Christine Keeler and Mandy Rice Davies and became friends, said Jean. There was this wonderful old lady, Mrs. Brewster, who sat downstairs at the Hotel Windermere, making sure everyone was suitably dressed in the evenings, but Zina wouldn't behave at all. Then in May, she rented the lower floor of a house, Villa Altamont. The tenants upstairs looked after the Darjeeling Zoo. Zina told me she was looking for a teacher and believed she was the reincarnation of Madame Helene Blavatsky. She had all her books and carried at least one of them everywhere she went. I gave her a list of names and addresses of lamas and monasteries in the region, and she got busy visiting, crossing them all off at an alarming rate. The Hotel Windermere was run by some other elegant Tibetans. The head of the family, Rai Bahadur Tendufla, headed the management committee of Gum Monastery. It was he who had arranged for Thupten Yeshe and Zopa Rinpoche to stay at Gum. With the assistance of the Bengal Commissioner North, an Armenian called Ivan Sarita. Zina asked me to accompany her on her excursions. She had already met most of the Kargyu and Nyingma lamas in the area, so she discussed with Tendufla where they could go next, said Jean. He had suggested she visit Gum, as there were 2 very good teachers there. It was a beautiful Sunday when Zina met the monks for the first time. Accompanying Jean and Zina was Jampa Geltsen Mutug-sang, a married Kargyu tulku whom Zina had found to translate for her. I took her everywhere to see everyone, he said. She wore Western dress with lots of jewelry and asked many questions. I knew Zopa Rinpoche from the young lama's home school, where we had spent 6 or 7 months together. She knew she wasn't meeting Domo Geshe Rinpoche, though at school we had always called Zopa Rinpoche Domo Rinpoche, because he had come from that monastery. I never heard him called Zopa until I met Westerners. Rinpoche invited us in and offered tea. The first thing Zina saw when the door opened was tiny Zopa Rinpoche looking up from his painting. She introduced herself and said she was looking for a Dharma teacher. At first she didn't see Thupten Yeshe, who was meditating in a corner of the dark room. Suddenly he called to Zopa in Tibetan, "Who is she? What does she want?" Rinpoche replied that she was seeking enlightenment. Thupten Yeshe was astounded to hear a Westerner express such a sentiment. The general attitude among Tibetans was that Westerners were unable to understand Dharma, and teaching them was a waste of time. Zopa Rinpoche had met Westerners before while at the young Lama's school. where the young Tulkus had often visited Western embassies in Delhi, but neither monk had ever met anyone like Zina. Zopa Rinpoche called for tea, which duly arrived, a big monastery kettle of salty Tibetan tea. A big mug of it was poured for Zina, who drank it all, immediately. That was the first time she had ever drunk Tibetan tea. I don't recall her ever drinking it again, said Rinpoche. Years later, Lama Yeshe recalled the day. So there we were. One morning a monk knocked at our door and said, Lama Zopa's friend has come to see him. It was Zina Reshevsky, a Russian-American woman who was supposed to be a princess or something. She said she'd come to the East seeking peace and liberation and asked me how they could be found. I was kind of shocked because I'd never expected Westerners to be interested in liberation or enlightenment. For me, that was a first. I thought, this is something strange but very special. Of course, I did have some idea of what Westerners were, but obviously it was a Tibetan projection. So despite my surprise, I thought I should check to see if she was really sincere or not. I started to answer her questions as best I could, according to my ability, but after an hour she said she had to go back to where she was staying in Darjeeling. However, as she was leaving, she asked, Can I come back tomorrow? So I said, all right. Zina liked the atmosphere and asked some questions about Buddhism, recounted Jean. Rinpoche answered very well, so she wanted to see him again. He agreed because, since he was convalescing, he had some spare time. But Zina needed help. Rinpoche's English was not good enough, and Thupten Yeshe didn't speak any English at all. So 2 or 3 times a week, I'd hire a jeep, and we'd spend an hour or two with them. They were always together, but Zina only spoke with Zopa Rinpoche because, being a Tulku, he sat on a higher seat. Also, he spoke some English. She came into our room like a thunderstorm, said Zopa Rinpoche, full of energy and enthusiasm, and talking sharp sense about some high things and completely complicated nonsense about others. Most of her questions were about astral trips and psychic powers and those things. Zina began visiting the monks every morning at 9, bringing new questions every time. One day she came with a rock on which the Buddha of Compassion's mantra, Om Mani Padme Hum, had been carved. What is this for? She asked. Another day she brought prayer flags. Explain these. Why do Tibetans do this? After 2 or 3 hours she left in the jeep. Zina always brought along her daughter Ria, who wasn't even a year old, but left in the jeep with her Nepalese nanny during these sessions. Villa Altamont. After a month of going back and forth to Ghum, Zina asked the monks if they would come and live with her in Darjeeling. Incredibly, they agreed, transferring themselves and their few belongings to Villa Altamont. They stayed in Zina's cold, glassed-in summer house for 9 months. This small outbuilding had 1 door, a table, and just enough room on the floor for the monks to sleep, 1 on either side of the door. Meanwhile, Zina swanned around her sprawling bungalow with a continuous parade of exotic guests. She addressed the monks as Lama Yeshe and Lama Zopa. Jampa Geltsen continued to be of service. The house she moved into was very good, but for a few days she didn't have a cook, so she asked me to cook for her. I couldn't, so I asked my wife to help. Then Zina hired a cook, a maid, and a driver, all Nepalese. The monks and I were the only Tibetans there. She was a very tough woman, said Jampa Geltsen. He continued to translate for Zina as needed, but as Lama Zopa Rinpoche's English improved, Jampa Geltsen's services became less essential. One day at Ghum, Zina met Clive Gibor and invited him back to tea. Clive was a teacher and an old Asia hand. Villa Altamont was very much the home of Princess Reshevsky, as she called herself, said Clive. She had posters from art shows in Greece where she had exhibited, a portrait of her father on the mantel, and a very beautiful silver tea service from which she served very correct English afternoon tea. I was living at a guest house down the road, but Zina asked me to move into Villa Altamont and share the expenses. I went to Sikkim and Kalimpong for a while, By the time I returned to Darjeeling, the Lamas had moved in. The house was in the Cooch Behar compound and owned by the Rani of Nangwan, who was in Chelsea at the time. Zena and I lived downstairs, where there were sitting rooms, small bedrooms, and a kitchen. The upstairs was rented separately. The little summer house that housed the Lamas was not in quite the same class. It was a tiny little building just opposite the front door, the kind of place where one stores deck chairs and lawn furniture, said Clive. It was never meant to be lived in. I used to make them soup in the evenings and take them porridge with bits of onion and dried meat added. We tried to give them food we thought they would enjoy, but a lot of what they were served was just frightful. I was there right throughout Zena's tenancy. Some Tibetans must have thought the monks had moved in for Western comforts, but they were nowhere near as comfortable in that summer house as they had been at Law Bungalow. Zena often gave them leftovers from parties and food she herself wouldn't eat. Tupten said that while he was at Villa Altamont, his stomach was never full. But I was not there for a full stomach. Still, there must have been a certain level of Western hygiene from which the delicate Lama Zopa was able to benefit, as during his time there his tuberculosis disappeared completely. Early every morning, a manservant brought tea to the Lamas while they did their daily prayers. Zena rose around 8, and the monks were always shocked by how she looked. When she first came out in her long dressing gown, she looked 70, recalled Lama Zopa. Then she spent 2 hours in the bathroom. The house only had one bathroom, so we all had to walk through her museum, things to paint, and fix her body spread out everywhere. Then at 10, when she came for teachings, she looked 20, maybe 25. A huge difference. Lama Yeshe, the natural clown, imitated Zena's face painting rituals to howls of laughter from Zena and her friends. "Am I okay?" he would say, looking worriedly into an imaginary mirror. Zena had an extensive wardrobe, wonderful jewelry, and a collection of wigs. She was fond of dressing up, often changing outfits several times a day. After breakfast, Zena spent the next hour or two with the monks, who went over texts with her and listened to stories about her remarkable life. After lunch, she usually went to one of Darjeeling's 2 movie houses, while Clive helped Lama Yeshe with his English. Both monks were absolutely dedicated to learning this language, often breaking out in Americanisms, hippie jargon, and modern idioms to the great amusement of their audiences. Several times a week throughout his time at Villa Altamont, Lama Yeshe walked 2 miles through the rain and constant fog to visit 2 elderly Christian women who were also teaching him English. They had devoted themselves to learning Tibetan in order to teach Tibetans about Christianity. Before class, they all sang Christian songs together. Zopa Rinpoche attended these sessions only occasionally. On his feet, Lama Yeshe wore thick, black rubber sandals made from automobile tires. Most of the buxom monks wore these, as they were very strong and very cheap. There were no cars or buses, and the monks had no money, so they walked everywhere. During this time, Lama Yeshe continued to study grammar and astrology with a well-respected local Sherpa, Nawang Yongten, who published an astrological calendar every year giving details of planetary movements, the world's weather, and auspicious events through the year. Soon Lama Yeshe himself was able to build an astrological calendar for a whole year. Nawang Pawo Rinpoche, who had first recognized the child Dundrup Dorje as a reincarnation of the abbess Ache Jampa, was also living in the area, residing at the oldest monastery in Darjeeling. When Lama Yeshe and Lama Zopa Rinpoche went to visit him, they took Zena with them. "His manner reminded me of Kabje Trijang Rinpoche," said Rinpoche later. "While he was talking to us, many flies were flying around the room. As he sat there, he'd stretch out his hand and catch one, then blow on it and let it go. Delighted with her llamas, Zina sent postcard photographs of Lama Yeshe holding baby Rhea to friends in Europe, including an old friend from Mykonos, Olivia de Halville, who was then working for the World Health Organization in Pakman, Afghanistan. "How do you like my babysitter?" wrote Zina. Olivia, who had a son the same age as Rhea, thought, "Oh God, what has Zina done now?" Although Zina was quite serious about developing a spiritual life, she was still pretty hedonistic. Drugs had been a part of her life for a long time. A true child of the 1960s, she had taken LSD with Timothy Leary at his Millbrook estate in New York. Marijuana was a staple in her life. "I don't know which came first for the Ingis," said Zopa Rinpoche, using the common term among Tibetans for Westerners, LSD or the way of the white clouds. Once when Zina was going out to buy marijuana, Lama Yeshe confronted her straight away and told her he didn't want her to use drugs. Zina suddenly realized he had known what she was doing all along. For Zina, life was still a party, hours in the bathroom, choosing jewels to wear, selling jewels or other possessions when funds were low, purchasing more from local craftsmen. She had stacks of matching luggage, closets full of fine linens, dinnerware and decorations. Wherever Zina set up home, it was always a palace. A princess needs an entourage, and Villa Altamont gave the monks their first experience of Ingis at play. Soon Lama Yeshe was adding cocktail party mimicry to his comic routines, holding his glass just right, turning self-consciously this way and that. His brilliant acting had everyone in fits of laughter. Thupten Yeshe had no illusions about Zina. He often hid his face as she strode through the local markets, traffic-stoppingly gorgeous in catsuit and cape, full of her own self-importance, insulting the local people, believing she was the reincarnation of Madame Blavatsky. The monks from Buxa muttered, "What is this senior monk and great debater doing with this arrogant Inji woman?" Lama Yeshe knew exactly what they thought. Zina was a classically samsaric woman. She was glamorous, famous, beautiful, and sought pleasure in material things. These had already failed her, but still she tried to squeeze the last drops of pleasure from them. She was not yet ready to recognize that all these things had so far failed to make her happy and could never do so, so she habitually returned to them for further unsatisfactory pleasure. But from Lama Yeshe's perspective, if Zina could learn Dharma, anyone could. Besides, he could see how unhappy she was. In the summer of 1967, Nicholas Dutschke came from Berlin. He stayed for a few months, and the whole time he was writing a novel on a continuous roll of paper, said Clive Gibor. Then there was Bhagawan Das, a.k.a. Michael Riggs, who helped the Lamas with their English, and his friend, a tall, thin American called Dharma Depot. Zina liked socializing, provided it was with the right people. I had a birthday party there one time and wanted to invite Mrs. Shaw, who ran the guest house, but that was just not on. "Zina and I were in love," said Nicholas. "With the Lamas there we had a wonderful family life around them. Every day the summer house throbbed like a drum as they did their practices. During that summer Zina and I received a kind of initiation and left the world of parties and hashish behind. Rhea was with us all the time. Lama Yeshe was the adult among us, even though he was just 32, the same age as me. Zina was 4 years older. It was amazing how Zopa could translate for us. He was just a teenager. Zopa Rinpoche was 21, but so slight everyone believed he was much younger. Zina was so unpredictable, constantly furious, impatient, unjust, and outrageous. Lama Zopa was absolutely scared of her. I spent all my time consoling people, assuring them she didn't really mean to hurt them. I was there for her in any way she needed me. We always had our meals with the Lamas. At night, as I wrote, I could hear their little bells and chants coming from the tea house. Bhagavan Das was already a famous figure at that time, an American who had become a Hindu guru and dressed like an Indian sadhu. I came to Darjeeling in the fall of 1967, got off the bus and found Zina's house. When we greeted each other, she said, "Michael, you have to meet my llamas," just like you'd say, "You have to meet my dogs." Their doghouse was a shack with windows. Lama Yeshe greeted me at the door, and I still remember his smile. It lit up the night sky like a sun. Lama Zopa sat in the corner, a skinny kid wrapped in a blanket. Lama Yeshe was his mother and so sweet and kind to him, just like my own grandmother, who raised me until I was 6 when she was killed. I loved being in that room with Lama Yeshe. I spoke Hindi like a 5-year-old, and he spoke it like a 7-year-old, so we were on the same page. He asked me if I would teach him English, and in return he taught me Tibetan Buddhism. We had tea together every morning for a couple of weeks while he taught me and I taught him. He was so humble. He always bowed to me when I arrived, and I kissed his hands. He was just pure love and devotion, a Mahasiddha, and rainbow light came out of his teeth. Back in Buxa and other North India refugee communities, plans for higher education programs for Tibetans were being explored. Around 650 miles southwest of Buxa and close to Sarnath, the site of Shakyamuni Buddha's first teaching at Deer Park, lay the holy city of Varanasi. The Tibetan government in exile had begun to draw up plans for a university curriculum to be instituted at Varanasi Sanskrit University as a way to adapt traditional Tibetan studies to a more modern educational setting. Monastery abbots and the best scholars were sent to Mussoorie in Uttar Pradesh, now Uttarakhand, to develop a new 9-year syllabus. Thupten Yeshe was chosen to go to Mussoorie as well. Losang Nima had already written to his teacher about this. "I told him to come quickly," said Losang Nima, "that it was already late. All he said was okay, but he never came. I was chosen for Mussoorie too, but waited for Thupten Yeshe, so I didn't go either." Dzong Rinpoche and several senior geshes wanted to save a place for Thupten Yeshe, but he stayed on in Darjeeling. Thupten Yeshe's classmates, Jampa Tekcho, Yeshe Thupten, Losang Doga, and Thupten Dawa, departed without him. His close friend, Jampa Gyatso, was sent first to Dalhousie Tantric College and then to Varanasi Sanskrit University. Out of these efforts to develop higher education opportunities for Tibetan refugees in India evolved an entirely new educational institution, the Central Institute of Higher Tibetan Studies. This new institute, established in 1967 at Sarnath as a wing of Varanasi Sanskrit University, provided advanced studies in Tibet's own academic tradition and made valuable contributions to the Indian cultural heritage. Dzong Rinpoche was appointed its first principal. From the 13th century onward, when Buddhist monasteries in India were destroyed by invaders, many of the original Buddhist texts had been destroyed. However, before that time, a large portion of the Buddhist canon of texts had been translated from Sanskrit into Tibetan and had thereby been saved. Now the Tibetan refugees were given the task of restoring those lost texts from the Tibetan sources. One of the responsibilities of the new CIHTS was to translate lost Buddhist scriptures and commentaries from Tibetan back into Sanskrit, as well as into Hindi and English. In 1977, the CIHTS became an autonomous body under the Ministry of Education. The official situation for almost every Tibetan refugee was extremely delicate, and here were two living totally outside the system. In spite of this, the lamas remained under the special protection of the chief Indian official in the area, Commissioner Ivan Surita, who controlled all of Bengal north of the Ganges, including the whole Darjeeling area. Clive Gibor. Ivan Surita was a fascinating man. He had bright blue eyes and was a scion of one of those old Armenian families in Calcutta. I don't think he liked Zina much, chiefly because he perceived her as having poached his Lama, Zopa Rinpoche, which she said, Ivan was very attached and faithful to Lama Yeshe and Lama Zopa. If it had been any Tibetan monks, other than those two, we would have had problems with them staying at Villa Altamont. Nevertheless, whenever Zina had visa problems, I wrote to Ivan on her behalf, and I know he helped her. Zina leaves Darjeeling. From Lama Yeshe's own recollections, Lama Yeshe's words, we gave her lessons every day, from about 9 or 10 o'clock until midday, which she liked very much. We finished up spending about 9 months there, quite a long time. Then Zina had visa problems and got into trouble with the Indian police. She was a very strong character, unusually strong for a woman. She told the police they were pigs and should stay away from her place. This rather annoyed them, so they tried to hassle her, but there wasn't much they could do until they decided to label her a Russian spy. Then they put a lot of pressure on her and kicked her out of Darjeeling. It was Christmas when the authorities finally said she had to go, said Clive. She gave a Christmas party and bought all these wonderful gifts for everyone and handed them out, but of course she bought them all on credit. The very next day she left for Ceylon, and the day after that the blizzard of unpaid bills started. Zina got the idea the Lamas could start a monastery in Ceylon, but Lama Yeshe told her that as he belonged to a monastery, he could not make that decision independently. Lama Yeshe's words. She wanted Lama Zopa and me to go with her to continue teaching her Dharma and meditation, but in order to travel we needed His Holiness the Dalai Lama's permission and some kind of refugee document from the Indian government. Only the Dalai Lama could give permission for him to dedicate himself to being her personal teacher in another country. Zina promptly wrote to Dharamsala and permission was granted. Leaving India was typically dramatic. Visas were delicate matters and Nicholas had already been expelled. Zina's Russian background, exotic title, and erratic behavior had long attracted the attention of the authorities. She went to Calcutta and thence to Madras, where suddenly the CIA-obsessed newspapers were running headlines. Spy princess flees India, maid detained, Madras airport.